Our next session we move on to straight away, and I'm sure this is one, again, that affects us personally, professionally, in our homes, in the workplace, and of course, nationally, globally. And we are addressing climate change and sustainability, macroeconomic trends, case studies, and a profile in horse racing. And first of all, we'd like to welcome up to make a presentation, Gladys Manin-Mallet, Senior Partner, McKinsey & Company.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be here today to talk about sustainability in the context of horse racing. I'm not an expert in horse racing, but I've worked on topics related to sustainability over the past decade, and I will try to bring some thoughts into the broader topic that I'm sure will be covered by the next presenter, who has worked on very specific levers in horse riding in Great Britain. So let me start maybe with a very quick overview of the case for change for sustainability. I'll go fast because I assume everyone is very well aware of the stakes. Then I'll try to talk about how can we move from playing the defense to playing the offense, a bit like sportsmen, sportswomen. And finally, I'll try to bring to life a few illustrations of what it could look like. So the net zero equation is not solved today. There was this big Paris climate agreement a few years back. We had lots of stakeholders, nations, industries taking commitments. But the truth is, versus the 1.5 degree global warming target, we are already at 1.1. And if we take the sum of all the commitments that have been taken so far, we would be at between 1.8 and 2.4. So we would be well above the target that we have set for ourselves as humanity by 2100. Seems to be a long, long time ago. When we see Florida, when we see Australia, France this summer, and so on, we see the climate change in action. So I would say the equation is far from being solved. However, we have also a big momentum. So I would say before the war in Ukraine, we could see this momentum playing out at full pace. I think currently we have what we call a detour, meaning that the direction remains the same, but given the energy shortages and so on, it's a bit less obvious. So I won't comment all the numbers on this page, but we can see that we have 90% of the emissions that we could reduce with all the alliances and commitments that companies have taken. Now, it has to convert into reality, but it seems that we have kind of a plan to mitigate this 90% of the emissions. There's also a lot of money coming into the financing of the transition. We are talking about $130 trillion of capital for assets that are basically limiting the global warming. So we see this through investors. So there is definitely money. We also have the consumers saying that they declare, and I'll come back to that they're ready to pay more for sustainable products. I'll come to that a bit later, because there's a difference between declaration and reality, as we all know. And then all the millennials, and I would say even more the Generation Z, want to work for companies or organizations that are taking very big commitments in regards to ESG more broadly, but sustainability in particular. Right? So I would say the equation is not solved, but we have momentum. I will skip a lot of the pages, but we've done a lot of calculations globally and by region, and we see a pathway for net zero, where basically the investments that are massive, talking about $9.2 trillion, we don't even know what trillion is because it's very gigantic numbers, but we also have market value of up almost the same magnitude. Unfortunately, it doesn't play out in the same way in every country, in every industry. So all in all, we have a balance. But if you take a region like Europe, each country has a different sector mix, and there are winners and losers by sectors, and it does not always fully compensate. So there is a huge transition, not only with money, but also socially, to make it happen. We see that many companies are actually leveraging this trend to create their business. So you have the example of Tesla. Everyone knows the electronic vehicle and how they entered an industry almost from nowhere, taking this very strong bet that vehicles would be electric in the next future. You have on the other extreme of the page Beyond Meat, which has invested in alternative proteins, which has a skyrocketing growth and market valorization. And they are also taking advantage, I would say, of these trends, in this case a little bit more around nutrition, but also anchored in sustainability. So playing the offense. So I took a soccer team and I put some women on it. I hope you like it. But basically, many companies and organizations are thinking about, oh my God, how do I mitigate the risk for my reputation and potentially regulatory risks? How do I finance this? This is the cost of capital to finance the transition. How do I mitigate the impact on my business if people believe that I'm not being sustainable? That's what I call playing the defense. Playing the offense is to say, okay, it's a constraint in a way, from a regulatory standpoint, probably from an expectation of citizens, consumers, customers, various stakeholders. And I'm basically leveraging this to transform my industry, transform my practices. So I can work on my operations. I'll give you a few examples later on. I can work on my existing product or existing service, and I can create new ones. And it's not being naive, because we have, if you see this, we valorize in terms of money, you can see that the cost that sustainability represents for most organizations could be more than offset by what we call playing the offense, meaning leveraging these constraints to reinvent what is being offered to consumers, customers, partners, suppliers, and basically create more value. In retail, which is a bit a sector that I know probably more than horse riding, we see Walmart saying, okay, I'm huge. My biggest impact is scope 3, meaning not in the scope of my stores and within my supply chain. It's all the suppliers that are basically, that I'm sourcing from, that have a big impact on carbon. And I can work on energy, on transport, on packaging, on waste, on product design, everything. I can have an impact on all these levers, and in a way use this resource efficiency to make savings and to also create a competitive advantage. The example of H&M is interesting. They've started to develop garments, apparel products with sustainable raw materials. These products, they sell 30% more. And it's a mass retailer. So this represents actually sizable volumes. It's not obvious that you would pay a product that is made out of recycled raw materials higher. For me, it's not intuitive. You could say, well, it's great for the planet, but why should I pay more? 30% more. That's what they extract in terms of value. So back to horse riding. This is a very simplified page of what I see as the 4 big components of your industry and what you offer. And again, there will be a presenter after me who is much more, I think, specialized in horse riding, but it starts with the animal breeding. So we are here in any kind of breeder. So it's not normally for you, it's not for human consumption, but any type of breeder has the issue of water usage, land use and biodiversity, the feed The feed is actually probably one of your biggest contributors. So it's not the horse in itself, it's the feed and where and how it is being produced. Then the emission from the animals, and then the waste at different steps of the value chain. So on this, there are pretty good news because honestly, we're making a lot of progress. And the second thing that I would say, I worked actually a lot in agriculture. It's one of the sector in which I work probably most. The belief today is that the animal has a role to play in the farming ecosystem. For me, this is a huge opportunity for your industry. We are showing that even if you want to produce plant-based because you want people to eat less meat, for instance, the animals are playing a role in the natural ecosystem. You can use the animals for fertilizing. You are using it also to take care of the field and so on. So there are virtuous, I think, ways of looking at animal breeding in the broader context of agriculture, which I think is very interesting for you. And you can have control on the feed. Because at the end of the day, it all comes from the feed. It's probably, I haven't quantified it for your industry, probably where it comes from for this first bucket. The second is where the races are taking place, and this is a lot about the water, to make sure you have the right grass and so on, that ensures the security of, I assume, the race, but also the beauty and so on. If it's completely destroyed, it just doesn't look like a good field to compete. So that you have, indeed, a bit like golf and other types of sports, this question of water and land use. And you have also all the energy to power the buildings around it and so on. I would assume that it's mainly linked to taking care of the field. And on this, there is also new technology coming in to help. And there are also compensation mechanisms if you put trees everywhere. It's not the tree to compensate that you plant in Ghana for the horse riding that you are doing in the UK. It's more thinking through, with the space that you have, if there are ways to promote the biodiversity, reintroduce trees, these type of things as well, which can also provide some benefits, including for the landscape and the beauty of the areas in which you operate. So beauty is always difficult to quantify, but it matters as well, I think, in terms of sustainability. Then you have the transportation, probably the tougher area, honestly, to tackle, because you need to transport people, you need to transport horses, so you can say, well, we're going to run a lot of things virtually, but I think the beauty, is also to see the horse, to hear them, to have the sound, and this is just... So I'm more of a soccer match fan, but I can see the difference between going in a stadium or being behind TV, which can also be fun, but it's a very different experience. So this will be obviously the most difficult area to tackle. And then there is the event in itself that I would say is quite easy. Honestly, we have multiple entertainment examples, concert, political campaign meetings, and so on and so forth, where honestly the recycling, the one-way, two-way packaging, this honestly can be organized. It's a bit of a mess because not everyone wants to have, I don't know how to say in English, the little non-disposable bottle or whatever. But honestly, the solutions exist. It's not about super fancy technologies. It's about a lot about discipline, operation, and operationally being able to deliver on the promises. And what is very interesting is people, consumers, stakeholders will see the plastic bottles and cups, and it's very bad, don't get me wrong, but from an environmental standpoint, it's probably much lower than the transportation and probably, of course, the other elements of this page. So it's important to address it because you look really bad if this is not being addressed. And don't get me wrong, but I probably haven't done the materiality assessment. It's probably smaller. Even though, if you have lots of people at the events, it can make a lot of cups. So I won't talk too much about agriculture. Honestly, I didn't have examples of horse breeding because usually the breeding that we have in my job are more other types of animals. But the levers apply on precision agriculture for the feed, how to optimize the nutrition of the animal to ensure health, performance, but also making smart choices in terms of what they consume and how what they consume has been produced. So I won't go into all the illustrations because otherwise it will be probably too long, but there are also technologies coming in to really bring some benefits. So that is an expertise area, but we've seen it in every type of animal. I say production, for you it's more breeding, because at the end it's not for consumption, it's really for the horse riding afterwards. So there are definitely opportunities here. And I would say that personally, I dislike the message that says that agriculture is part of the problem. I think agriculture is part of the solution. Why? Because agriculture sequestrates carbon. It is, if you are using non-virtuous practices, you have a carbon impact, but it is also part of the life cycle. Okay? So the question in agriculture is to change the narrative, obviously evidenced by actions, to say we need agriculture to eat. We need to feed people. We need to feed these animals. So the question is, how do we evolve the practices to mitigate and even, playing the offense, make it something that is not only net zero, that is positive in terms of the environmental impact. And that I truly believe in. So that I think is food for thought as well for you. We need to really, really transform, because also for breeders and for farmers, it's really not something they want to hear. A lot of people are, I don't know in horse breeding, but in other types of farming, people are close to the survival threshold, at least around the world. And on top of that, they are criticized for producing what they produce for our own consumption. So we need to support this transition. There is obviously technology, financing, education involved. It's not easy, but we have quite a lot of the solutions today, not in 10 years. We have most of the solutions today. I will skip a lot of, and the issue on I don't know for the horse riding, is that the breeders are very often small entities. So their ability to finance a transition of their practices is tougher. That's why you need to have a systemic approach where you help them on the biggest levers, and they can be quantified specifically for horse riding. Then you put in place these levers and you help them, as opposed to having a punishing posture, because I think it's absolutely, I don't think it's fair, and trust me, I'm very committed to sustainability, but I also see the lives and the livelihoods of farmers, and I think we have to be very responsible in what we say and how we support them. So we have lots of technologies. I could talk for a long time. So then on the entertainment part, we've seen with the Olympic Games some rising concerns about these events. So in the case of, if I take the example of Beijing, it was winter games. They had to produce artificial snow, and the snowmaking was tapping into water sources that were supposed to go to human consumption or farming. So there was a lot of criticism around the winter games in Beijing. In Tokyo, they wanted to do the green games, and I think they did quite a lot, but they were also very much criticized for the road to Tokyo that was criticized as being a source of rainforest destruction. If you talk about Rio, they had to build a lot of things, a lot of infrastructure, and there were a lot of criticism on the toxic waste disposal of these buildings. And to the point where some of the Olympic Games, now the number of cities that are candidates to welcome the Games has been declining. So because, of course, it costs a lot of money, you have a business case, etc. But the citizen acceptance of hosting the Olympic Games has evolved over time. So I think it's a good source of inspiration because they have to work a lot. And what I described on the day of the event, the recycling, the circularity, the packaging, and so on, the food that is being produced, the waste management, all of this, I think we have very large-scale events where we are working on these levers. What we also see in consumer, if you take sporting wear more broadly, we see also that people, because normally when you buy a sport equipment, a garment or an equipment, you think about the performance, okay? I mean, you want to have a good tennis racket, you want to have good shoes, etc. Now we see the sustainability of the sporting gears to be an area of concern, and it's really rising. So it's an indication, it's not horse riding, but it shows that it is spreading across categories. This page is really interesting, I'll summarize it, but basically, when we ask the consumers, is sustainability so matters, they are ready to pay more, etc., 75% say sustainability matters to me a lot. 50% are ready to pay more. 25% truly pay more. So, you know, it's very interesting in your stakeholder management because everyone will tell you it's important. They will declare a lot of things, but then when it comes to paying this extra that will finance the ability to make something more sustainable, it's going to be a bit tougher. I wanted to give you examples of other industries, sports associations. So the NBA, I think it's interesting. They invested a lot in solar energy. They also have a very ambitious plan on trees. They have started to use also recycled glass, and they took some. So they caught out recycled glass in some of their events. So they are also on a journey. FIFA, of course, they took some commitments on being carbon neutral with energy efficiency, everything that they can do in terms of transportation. I think there's a lot in offsetting, to be honest, and that comes from the transport of people attending the events. And then for the PGA, I think it's interesting. They have been emphasizing a little bit more the waste and the recycling. So they have changed, they have different cursor on their sustainability. And we also see all the brands, I mean, it's a subset, they are not brands you have different brands for horse riding, but you can see that there is a lot of commitment behind it. R&D, product design, marketing is organized around making a transition in what they offer without compromising on performance or style, depending on your brand positioning. So it's an and, it's not an or. So in conclusion, I will stop presenting. My view, again, I've worked for more than 10 years on sustainability strategies and so on. I think it's here to stay. I mentioned the detour given the war in Ukraine, but the direction is still there, and climate change is here to stay, unfortunately. So the question is, how do you also balance defensive versus offensive measures? No greenwashing, because today people are quite educated, and that can create a liability for you if people perceive that there is no authenticity behind your actions. That's why I mentioned the breeders. Okay, you are a breeder. We ask you to breed animals that are going to be of amazing I say performance by lack of a better word. Animal welfare is important too. We understand the size of your farm. We understand your constraint. What can we do to help you in adopting different practices that I truly believe in, and we see that in other agricultural sectors. I think in terms of how you manage the horse riding, there are also things that I see that there are lots of things in motion. You have not been sitting and waiting for, but the question is, what can be the most ambitious plans that you can consider? What are also the technologies in water usage and so on that you can adopt, maybe to be leading edge, even to innovate or test new solutions. And then on the D-Day, I think there are quite some low-hanging fruits in terms of how the events are being managed, and that we have, I think, examples of other types of entertainments where lots of experimentations are being done today. So that's it. It's a bit in a nutshell what I wanted to share. I'm available for questions, and I may not have all the answers.
Clarisse, thank you very much. Some fascinating insight, particularly about changing the narrative with evolving policies and the fact that solutions are here right now for us to take advantage of. And obviously consumers, as you've pointed out in your slides, they are ready for sustainability change. So a lot of positives from Clarisse. Now we'd like to welcome Brant Dunshay, the Chief Regulatory Officer for British Horse Racing Authority and Project Executive Sponsor for the report on environmental and sustainability in British racing.
Thank you, Rishi, and thank you, Clarisse, for a fabulous presentation. Many in the room might find it odd that I'm here to speak on environmental sustainability, bearing in mind you work with me on a day-to-day basis in racing. But for me, this is a very personal issue, and when asked to take the executive lead on this particular industry project for the British Horse Racing Authority, I was very excited to do so. Around 20 years ago, I embarked on a project myself to fully retrofit out a home that I'd purchased, which took considerable investment and considerable time. But after a period of 2 years of hard work, we turned that home into a home that no longer bore utility bills. And so for the next 10 years, I was able to reside in that home, having invested in it, and not only feel good about trying to do something positive for the environment, but it was an incredibly cost-effective exercise. And so wind the clock on some 20 years later, and I'm just about to embark on a very similar exercise on a much grander scale in the south of England, which I'm very much looking forward to. But we've heard from Clarisse today, and we know I don't need to go into the detail on it, but scientists and world leaders agree that our planet is warming due to human activity, and the collective action is required to avert the worst effects of climate change. Governments and industries and businesses are considering the impact of climate change on their operations and how they can build a more sustainable future. And with its access to vast swathes of land and existing expertise in environmental management, British racing, we believe, is well placed to show leadership and innovation in this area. And work hard to mitigate the risks and grasp the opportunities. So late last year, a project was conceived in Britain. It was a cross-industry study commissioned by British Racing's Executive Committee, which includes the BHA, our thoroughbred group, which comprises our participants, and our race courses. It was funded by the Racing Foundation, and it was delivered by sustainability consultants White Griffin, and they work closely with our BHA project team on this. The aims of the study were to build a clearer picture of progress on environmental sustainability across racing and breeding, establishing what had already been done, and importantly, where there was potential opportunity for growth. It sought to identify the key risks, challenges and opportunities presented by climate change, and produced a series of recommendations for how these can be addressed. The project itself, it ran over a 3-month period. It was delivered via a combination of independent research, industry-wide questionnaires and surveys, of which we received around 200 responses, around 50 of those from organisations and around 150 from individuals. There were meetings held, case studies were examined, and site visits were undertaken. And so, as I'd said, the project sought to identify the key challenges, and they were identified in the report. And what I'll go through now is not an exhaustive list by any means of what was found in that extensive report, but rather provides an overview of what are considered the key areas requiring attention. So, lots of themes here that we will have heard from Clarice in her presentation. And I'll just go through 6 of the key challenges that were identified in the report. And first of all, fossil fuels and greenhouse gas emissions is an obvious one, and was identified by Clarice. The combination of rising energy costs, in particular this year with the events in Ukraine, etc., the increased demand for fuel, legislative commitments of governments now to meet targets, and the future onset of regulations around this for them to meet those targets, changing consumer behaviour, all means that organisations are moving to a cleaner and more sustainable forms of energy. In Britain, racing is heavily reliant on fossil fuels for powering buildings and machinery on race courses, transportation of people and horses. An example of this, which we identified through this work, was that we learned that your average British jockey covers more than 4,000 miles. That's 5,000 kilometres per year. The report recommends setting high industry targets around emissions, net zero by a certain date. What we will need to do is start baselining, using carbon footprinting exercise, especially travel related, and then see how we can work towards transitioning to renewables across the industry. Water availability and extreme weather was identified as a key challenge. We've seen this summer throughout Britain, water is crucial for our industry. For example, we know it's necessary to maintain safe ground for our horses, ensures the welfare of our horses in hot weather and our participant well-being. And it's also essential for managing operational requirements on racecourses, such as sanitation and catering, etc. The UK Environment Agency has warned that unless action is taken soon, water demand in the UK will outstrip supply by 2050. Restrictions were put on water usage across many parts of Britain during the summer. In my part of the UK, it was extraordinary this year to see ground that I recall growing up on in Australia many years ago. That was how extreme it was in Britain this year. Fortunately, racing is exempt for now on those water restrictions, but we're seeing that some parts of the UK are extending those water restrictions through till the end of this year, even though we've come into the autumn. And at the same time, we've seen examples across the globe this year of extreme weather events that leads to flash floodings. And that similarly has its own risk of challenges associated with it. Our report notes the potential impact of increasing temperatures on the horse populations, especially in the case of spikes of unseasonal times of the year, or the possibility of certain warm weather diseases becoming more prevalent. And I think that's something we'll be discussing tomorrow at the Executive Council, the paper in relation to that. The report recommends an audit of water usage and availability particularly for racecourses. Options are available, including harvesting rainwater, boreholes, reservoirs. But they all require planning and money. And in the event where you might seek to put in place flood defences, for example, to protect your operations, they are not cheap. In terms of biodiversity and land use, to racing, land is a significant asset. In Britain, there are 3,000 plus yards, studs, racecourses with tens of thousands of acres under management. Given the scale of land use within our sport, government biodiversity targets and recovery of the natural environment does present a particular opportunity for us, we believe, in Britain, especially if grants are made available by governments in order for them to meet their targets. There are risks involved that need to be considered, and I was talking earlier with Craig Swan about land management and how, as Clarice indicated, it is a virtuous circle if it's done correctly. And, for example, the use of pesticides are now becoming further under pressure. So farmers need to look at alternatives, and that cuts across our industry as well. Waste management, recycling. So often the go-to when people think about the environment is single-use plastics. And I think Clarice well explained that actually, in terms of the grand scheme of things, it's not the highest of those challenges, but it is the most prominent in the consciousness of people. Racing's waste includes day-to-day solid waste such as paper, card, containers, food waste, etc. But there are also bigger pieces of infrastructure to consider. For example, in Britain, we've identified through this work that there are more than 160 miles on racecourses of white running rail and plastics associated with obstacles, which are often not recyclable. Then, of course, there's the manure, with each horse producing approximately 50 pounds of manure daily. Again, government targets and regulatory requirements mean that this is not a straightforward area for us to address. It can be complex. And we need to be especially cautious around terminology. Terms like reuse, recycle, recovery have to be thought through and applied appropriately. Because if we're committed to this, we must do it properly. And there'll be much that we'll need to do, or will need to be done in terms of establishing how we deal with our waste. The report talks about taking a centralised approach. Initiatives like seeing whether or not on-site processing and segregation of waste can be feasible, using online resources to help with that, and ultimately phase out, in the end, the use of single-use plastics. The report talked about commercial partnerships and the supply chain as well. Commercial deals are increasingly becoming agreed, not just on financial merit, but with regard for social and environmental considerations. We see businesses aligning themselves with environmentally conscious brands through partnerships of purpose. Businesses now are also working alongside suppliers to design products that use fewer resources and with greater consideration for the product's end-of-life strategy. Supply chains are at risk of breakdown due to climate-related issues, such as extreme temperatures, for instance. And once again, during this very hot summer in Britain, we experienced challenges with infrastructure, breaking down, transport, trains, etc. Racing can gain commercial advantage by using collective purchasing power and work with suppliers to affect product life cycle. We can ensure future partnerships align with racing's values and centralise procurement where possible on these issues. Importantly, reputation management and social responsibility was identified in our work. This is something that we are all conscious of, but younger people are increasingly more environmentally conscious, and in this regard are spending money on products and services that align with those values which they share. In 2001, 3/4 of British adults said they were worried about climate change, and Generation Z and millennials are much more likely to spend their money on sustainable products. As with other areas like welfare, diversity and inclusion, people, Our report recommends that we respond positively to these challenges, promoting our progress in the areas of sustainability while making sure our words are underpinned by robust plans and actions. So in terms of the overarching recommendations, I've gone through the key challenges. In total, the report contained 23 recommendations with specific next steps around the key challenges listed on those previous slides. But it also recognises future-proofing British racing against these challenges is best achieved, as with so many areas in our sport, through a coordinated, industry-wide approach. And so, what do we need to do ultimately, as reflected in this report? And this is obviously reflecting the circumstances in Britain, but of course it could be the same for any other racing jurisdiction around the world. We need to take a planned and strategic approach to sustainability as a sport, agree a central governance framework and an overarching strategy, work with experts to identify short, medium and long-term objectives around the key risks and opportunities. We need to embed a leadership culture throughout our industry, empower our leaders and those with specialist knowledge and expertise to manage and deliver this change, upskill and utilise external support where there are gaps in skills and understanding. We need to encourage industry-wide measuring, monitoring and reporting. So support racing's businesses to introduce and embed regular environmental measuring and monitoring into their operations with central reporting tools. We might as well do it now because there will come a time in the future where government will impose this on us through regulation anyway. So let's get ahead of the game. Create a robust funding framework. As I explained at the beginning, these things cost money, these sorts of initiatives, and we need to coordinate funding and investment within the long-term strategy with fully costed plans to support our businesses right across the breadth of the sport. Fund research, undertake audits, pilot schemes, so actions are workable and are underpinned by scientific evidence. We should seek to standardise knowledge and encourage collaboration, share best practice and learning tools, and coordinate key projects to avoid duplication of effort. And I think that's something collectively as an international federation we could do very well. We need to centralise processes where possible. For example, procurement I talked about earlier, and maximise cost savings and enhance that collective influence we have as a global community. And in terms of communication and engagement, education, we need to develop a communications and engagement plan aligned to our industry's strategy. Consideration should be given to engagement with stakeholders, making sustainability relevant. And so that's where, in Britain, we are now working towards the development of a collective industry strategy. British racing's leaders are presently working together on that industry strategy to future-proof the sport with long-term commitments and a sustainable model for us to achieve this. And environmental sustainability, you may have noted, was actually referred to as a key area of focus of that industry strategy, which was published when we put out a media release on those works to develop that strategy last week. The strategy work within Britain is being led by the BHA, and what we will need to do is ensure there are measurable objectives and targets for growth, and detailed timescales and project plans will need to be developed as part of that overall industry strategy, specifically relevant to environmental sustainability. Initiatives and developments that arise from this will be published as this work continues and is ongoing. But I think it's really important to note, and Winfred touched on it earlier this morning, that the IFHA have also established a committee, and it is a key focus area, a key strategic focus area for the IFHA. And through the establishment of that committee, we are, and I'm very, very privileged to be a part of that committee, we are working collectively now already on developing a suite of tools to help racing organisations around the world better understand the challenges and better deploy solutions for the future. Thank you.
Brand, thank you very much. Obviously, this session, like the previous one, welcome to questions from the floor. So if you have a question for either Clarice or Brand, then please feel free to put your hand up and we'll get the ball rolling. But I'll start with one question to you both. Obviously, the sport of horse racing is part of the leisure industry, entertainment. If horse racing doesn't adapt, the breeding industry as well as the actual sport itself, how serious is the threat of the existence, the very existence of the sport?
I guess the question will be the consumer acceptance. Do you want to have like people coming to the race and demonstrating and complaining about how it's being organized, these type of things? Because I was mentioning the Olympic Games. I know it's much bigger and it's a gigantic event, but you see a resistance anti-games. I mean, most of the people are welcoming the games and they're going to support the athletes that they love and so on. But you also have an anti-games movement that starts to discredit, I would say, this type of events. And then the second thing is the feeling. I'm doing agriculture, consumer, retail. I can tell you in the fast fashion industry, now there's a guiltiness that was not existing 10 years ago. So now you buy, is it good, is it healthy to do so? Is it protecting the so I think there is the direct impact of people criticizing and being active and advocates for different practices. And you have then the individual feeling. And I think when you go in entertainment, you want just to have a great time. You want to feel like you are, having a good time without this guiltiness, is this, Yes. So I think that's more what I would say.
Guilt-free fun,
Exactly.
which is obviously something that would have crossed quite a few people's minds during the summer in Britain, Brant. Because a lot of people were obviously in drought areas. Those drought areas, as you pointed out in your speech, still exist some parts of the country in the UK. Yet, obviously, horse racing continued in the UK. Obviously, they have their own reservoirs, etc., at some race courses. But there is that little thing at the back of the mind, isn't there? That, well, are we feeling guilt-free here, or is there a little bit of guiltiness?
And ultimately, Rishi, it links into what we heard earlier from the likes of Tony Parker around, fan engagement. Younger people are setting the agenda now in terms of, social license to operate. So whether it's welfare or things like the environment, if we are going to engage with the next generations, we've got to have these issues front and centre as part of our strategic focus for taking our sport forward. It's essential.
If there are any questions, please feel free to jump in at any point. Yes, sir, at the back, there's a microphone coming your way.
Don't you think that there is a movement from animal activists to climate activists?
Animal and climate activists, Clarice.
You mean animal welfare becoming as important?
Animal activists is the people which are saying that we are cruel by
Yeah.
making horses.
Yeah. So actually, when you look at, we have lots of consumer insights across countries and so on, and we usually test ESG, so not only environmental elements, but also social aspects. And we see the animal well-being going up in the important attributes within the consumers that we are serving. So it is indeed rising up. And my core belief, by the way, that's why I was emphasizing the breeders and the farmers, is we cannot isolate environmental concerns with social concerns. And it goes together, right? So people are having specific practices for a reason. So you cannot just so back to the animal. I think it's part of the broader image of your sport, and I think you need to tackle the whole thing and be able to articulate the whole journey you are on. And indeed, animal welfare is going up across all countries. I was personally surprised by how much it's become important. I have the data, I'll give it to you afterwards. By country, it's really going up.
Brian?
Look, I mean, we know in Britain the challenges that we face from a welfare perspective, and we are working very hard as a collective industry through the development of our welfare strategy, the establishment of the Horse Welfare Board, to ensure that we deal with these issues, tackle them, see them as opportunities. And I think there is certainly something in what Roland has just asked around that link, and I think they inevitably are linked. There's no doubt about that.
Okay, I'll ask you another question for the moment that I'm quite interested to get your answer on, and that's obviously you've both mentioned about racing, breeding, having heavy reliance on greenhouse gas emitting fossil fuels, petrol, electricity for the buildings, machinery, infrastructure. Changing that is clearly a long-term objective. It's not going to be done overnight. So how do you go about addressing the administrators, addressing race courses and these wealthy breeders or people that need to make the change? How do you convince them, and are they open to the change?
Sometimes the solutions are not as complicated as we think. We have to be prepared to think outside the square and think about doing things differently. And so I think what's most important for us as a sport is to think about, have our traditional practices that we've adopted in some areas of our sport the right ones for the future? Are they sustainable ongoing? Are there other ways we can do things to actually make a significant inroad into some of those challenges, particularly in relation to the use of fossil fuels? And I think it is possible, but we've got to be prepared to change.
Clarice, what's the reception like when you present the data to people in the agricultural industry and point out to them that the need for change is immediate? Is it a receptive response?
No, not really, because but again, I don't know the horse breeders' economics. I know dairy, I know lots of other agricultural commodities, and if the economics are not flying, they just, they are open to discussing, but they can't make it happen. So I would really differentiate the levers that are in your hands. How do you hold events? What's your the specs of how an event should be run? I think the field and how do you manage water, biodiversity on the site, and so on. I would honestly, it's in your hands, and I think you have most of the levers. Sometimes there is an extra cost, but then you need to find a way to get it financed. But I would say it's in your hands. I think for the breeders, it's a bit different. And you don't change practices so easily, right? So this is what we're doing with agricultural companies is the full playbook of levers with the economic equation, and that is taking a bit longer, indeed. So, but it's not a problem of usually of technology. It's the transition time, because you need training. So, for instance, if you change the feed that you give to your animal, it has an impact on the growth and the performance and so on. So it requires also very often data and science, so you make the right shifts from a sustainability standpoint, but from different dimensions that you want to optimize. In the case of the horse, I assume that there are also consequences on the health and the performance and the resistance and so on. So if you have recipes that have been working forever, and you have been asked to change them without a guarantee that it's going to work. So that's why typically we have we take a farm where we experiment different practices, and then we use it as an academy. So it takes time. It's a lot of change management, but it's also science. You want to make sure that it works.
Okay.
Can you expand a little bit on some of those technologies that we grow a lot of grasses, whether we race on them or our competitors eat them? Specifically to that, what would be new methods?
So to grow the
To not conserve water, to use less pesticides.
Yeah. So yeah. So this. So typically, for instance, we take a lot of our best practices from Israelis. I think usually in Israel they have the most advanced agricultural techniques. So precision agriculture to reduce the amount of water, and you need to be able to assess the quality of your soil. You need to be able to do some weather forecast. You need to be able to use data to use the right quantity of water. And probably, I don't know, depending if you're in the UK or in other countries, there might be 20-25% of water usage that you can save. But it's not like this. You need to calculate that. This we see for, if I may, much more extensive agricultural practices than horse riding. And we see it at play, including in the US, in Canada, and so on. And back then in Ukraine, Russia, all the large agricultural countries. In terms of the equipment, there are also new types of equipments where you get more productivity, less energy input, and so on. On the fertilizing, we are going to see, in particular in Europe, a shift from chemical pesticides to organic pesticide. And this is where animals are going to be part of the solution, because you're going to substitute specialty chemicals with what the animals are producing. We have currently capacities being built to make the substitution. But again, you need the knowledge, because when you substitute, it doesn't do exactly the same, and to know the proportions and so on. But that we see, and I don't know what you are leveraging in terms of know-how. I'm working for my clients with agronomics, and we need to experiment. It's not PowerPoint. You need to do it in a real farm with a real breeder, with real ingredients, see the before and after, calibrate the solutions. So you would need, and what I see, so in France, for instance, the young farmers, they don't want to do the farming that their dads were doing. They say, I don't want to do that anymore. So first, they don't want the lifestyle that goes with it. Impossible, like working 7 days a week, no holidays. You know, they don't want that anymore. I mean, and we see, by the way, across the Western world, a reduction in animal production for different reasons, but including the livelihoods and the willingness of the new generation to take these jobs. And we see an aging. Again, I don't know for the horse breeders, but I see it in dairy. I have database when I do projects. I have Bertrand, whatever, 58. Henri, 62, etc. And then we see, do you have a son? Does he want to take? No. Yeah. So it's written. So that's why I'm saying environmental and social are linked, because you need to be able to, and that's why we have, for instance, new farms where there are 2 or 3, so they can have 1 weekend out of 3. It's as pragmatic as that. Huh? They can have 1 weekend out of 3. They can have a few weeks of holidays. They need to have contracts that allows them to make a better living, and so on and so forth. So it's a whole. But I've seen a lot of these technologies at scale, and not small. And then, sorry, I very passionate about this topic. The problem that you have is the recipes are going to be tailored to the climate and the soil in which you operate. So if you are in the UK and it still rains a lot, even if you had the draw in, so it's going to be different than in the Middle East or wherever you and the problem is the investment in the knowledge is significant, and you don't have a one-size-fits-all model. But we have the library of levers. We know how to quantify. We know how to apply.
We'll just take a couple more questions. So.
Thank you, Rishi. 9 references to breeding in this session, so inevitably nobody's going to be surprised that prompts a response from Des Layden from the Irish Thoroughbred Breeders Federation, for the International Thoroughbred Breeders Federation. And I think this has been a wonderful session. It's highlighted a lot of things that are very important. But I think, as ever, we can champion our industry in a way that probably we haven't been doing as we should. And that is because stud farming is so different from normal agricultural land use. We are de facto environmentally friendly, low density, rural employers. We do not fertilize. We do not produce large volumes of methane gas. Our animals largely are fed on grass, and that's not intensively prepared grass. Our preference is always for old grasses that have been present in pastures for generations. We surround our horses more often than not with hedging, which creates and promotes biodiversity. Many stud farms now create riparian strips because these are pathways for the migration of wildlife. And so, in terms of the extensive land use that is inherent in the thoroughbred breeding industry, we have the opportunity to champion it. But importantly, as I think has been so beautifully illustrated by your presentation here today, there is now means of quantifying just how beneficial that activity is, because you can compare and contrast it to high density, high fertilization, high land use entities, and say of all the entities that we have, stud farming creates national assets which are reflected in a wonderful environment and great biodiversity. Thank you, Rishi.
Des, thank you. I think some very salient points made positively about our industry. Do we have any other questions, Jeffrey?
Hi there. I'm wondering, you gave some commercial examples there, like H&M, etc. Do you see a time where breeders are producing, like they have a badge to say that this foal has been produced on sustainable lines? Purchasers are buying horses only from those breeders because it really is important to them. They are only being fed from sustainable feed producers, and therefore, instead of asking horse racing to make the change, it's actually the market force that drives that change. Do you see that being a long way away, or not?
I would say, so I love the earlier intervention. It was beautifully said, and I can measure how my accent is ugly when I hear you. But no, and this is correlated. I don't have a crystal ball, but I believe that the service to nature that agriculture is providing needs to be not only celebrated, but valorized. So the projects that I hope to do in 10 years from now will be actually revenue flows going to farmers and breeders for their contribution to the protection of ecosystems. Now, it needs to be real, and you need to be able to measure that you are not damaging the soil, that you're on the contrary enriching the soils and so on, and the animals have a role to play in protecting the environment. So, and what I'm saying is not science fiction. I see it in dairy. I'm working actually for COPs in Ireland and England, north of Europe. And it's much more intensive than horses. Huh? Don't get me wrong, it's very different. Nevertheless, they sequestrate carbon, they protect lands by having an agricultural activity. And if they adopt different practices, they can claim a very positive impact. So what we are working on is also new certifications and so on. So it's not going to be so much organic or not organic. It's going to be net zero, low carbon practices, and even nature positive practices. And we have investors looking into it actively because they are looking for compensation So you can plant trees in sub-Saharan Africa, and by the way, it's really good also for the local populations and so on. But the investors, they are looking for projects where they can deploy money. And I think that in the Western world, we have an opportunity if we are able to measure it. Because again, it cannot be conceptual. I'm meeting next week a startup that has defined a DNA measurement of the soil. Because we are very good on carbon, but we are very bad on nature. And I'm looking forward to understand what they've done. But basically, what's the biodiversity that is being protected? What's the health of the soil? And so on and so forth. And if we are able to measure the nature positive impact of practices, then we can put money behind it because we can certify it. So I see it coming. I see it coming quite fast. And that would be an amazing news for breeders and farmers.
Well, this session, I'm pretty certain, could carry on for eternity. We're going to take one last question, sir? Okay, one final question for this session, and I'm sure you might get harassed once we go for coffee for some more questions, but this is the last one of this session.
Thank you, Rishi, for accommodating. Satish Iyer from India. I would just like to know, or rather understand, how would the microeconomic trends be impacted if we did not achieve an optimal level of sustainability in the next decade or so?
Okay.
I do not believe that I'm qualified to answer that one, so I'll hand that to Clarice.
So when you say microeconomic, you mean at what level? What is micro for you? Macro or?
It's micro, because today we understood what macro is.
Yeah.
But when we talk of economy, we have a dealing of both the micro and macro aspects. So that's where I'd like to know, where would we stand in the next decade or so if we didn't achieve an optimal level of sustainability?
But you mean beyond horse riding?
Overall context, please.
You mean globally and?
Yes, globally.
Well, I mean, we have the forecast of the amplification of natural disasters and so on. So we know that, I don't know if this is where you were going. I think the consequences on livelihoods, on ability to do business and so on, around the world, India in particular, we've measured the impact of global warming on India. It is absolutely massive because millions of people will not be able to work outdoor. And in the situation of India, a lot of the work is outdoor. And at a certain level, a human being cannot work, even if you are used to heat. It's just humanly not possible anymore. So this microeconomics impact will be on the ability to work and therefore create wealth and therefore to make a living. So that's why I'm always connecting environment with social, and the most vulnerable people on the planet, economically, will be the most impacted by the global warming. So I don't know if it answers your question, but it's massive impact also on health. Again, we've made the analysis on India, but other countries, because you have an increase in respiratory allergies, respiratory disease, allergies, etc. So you also have a death rate that is rising due to the heat, and I can go on and on, unfortunately. So,
well, thank you very much, Clarice and Brent. Thank you for your contribution.
Thank you very much.
Excellent session. We are going to take a very quick break.